Welcome to the Finish Line with Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and the Finish Line is all about finishing our quilt tops. And today I'd like to share with you 2 tips on binding unusual angles. The binding goes on the same way, and the corners are done the same way. It's all about angles and where we're going to stop. And we're going to be able to do that for any angle on our binding. I have been working on this quilt topper that does have 60-degree angles. So the first thing I like to do is prepare my quilt top. After it's all been quilted, I do want to make sure that it lies flat. And I do a little row of zigzag or top stitch, and that compresses the batting. And it's stabilized with that extra row of stitching. That way when I do put the binding on, I know that it's not going to stretch as I'm working on this binding. Now this method will work with any way you want to do your binding. It won't matter the size of the binding. It won't matter if it's on the straight of grain or a bias binding. So any way you stop, start, and do your binding is fine. But today I just want to share with you the technique that I do for these unusual corners. And it won't matter the angle, this system is going to work. So let's go right to the machine and get started. I will be stitching this on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so I will be using my 1/4 inch foot. I like to cut my binding at 2 1/4 inches. I have one angle cut 45 degrees, and I just glued down a little edge. I did sew the strips together on that 45-degree angle to reduce the bulk, and now I'm going to be able to stitch this on. I'm going to start right off of this point and stitch right on. But this little point, I'm going to do a little bit less than 1/4 inch. By moving my needle over, I'm still going to be able to use the edge of my foot. And I'm going to stitch from one point to another. Just following that edge. Now I'm going to raise the needle. Now I can move my needle over right to the center spot. So the seam is going to come down and over. And I'm just going to stitch this down until I get really close to one of those corners. When I get close to that corner, I'm going to just fold that back, and I'm going to put a pin right here in this angle. Just pull that pin back so just a little bit of the point comes up. Match up that edge, just have the pin come out. This is now giving you a mark, and that's where I want to stop. So it won't matter what angle you're at. We just need to find that center line. And stitch. Until you come to that pin. Rotate that fabric and just stitch right off. By using this little pin method so that we can mark underneath, it really shows us where to stop. And that is tip number 1. Take a pin and just pin that corner down. So that pin is on the angle and that stitching stopped on the angle. Bring that binding up and then have it come down. The raw edges do need to match, so this fold in the corner match. You can always transfer that pin. I like leaving a thread tail, it just gives me a little handle. And my first stitch is going right into that edge of fabric. Line this up. You can take this thread handle and just give a couple of stitches until you get started and continue stitching. When I turn this binding around to the back, you can see that little 45 is right in line with the seam. So just to recap, when you come close to that corner, we want the pin on a 45-degree angle. So put the pin in and have it come up just a little bit as you're laying this fabric down and poke it through. Stitch coming to that pin and then stitch off. And by stitching off, it doesn't matter the angle. It just saves us from having to tie a knot. Give yourself a thread tail, put a pin in the middle of that angle. The fold that comes up needs to fit at this point, and we match up the raw edges. I do like to transfer that pin. And that is trick number 2. And this extra thread is just giving me tension. And off we go. When it comes to finishing this end where I started, I did have that seam allowance folded in. So I'm going to come and I'm going to cut that top fabric on an angle just above it. So that fabric is still on a bit of an angle. Now I can take that and just tuck it right up inside and smooth it over. You can always add a little bit of glue just to hold those layers together. From here we can finish stitching, and we're at that true 1/4 inch, so I'm going to stitch until I come to that little area where I change that measurement. So underneath I had that scant 1/4 inch to about here. Now I'm going to go right over top of it to there. I just want to make sure that I'm going to stop and start on the same stitching line. Stitch for an inch or so, and then just stitch off. Now when I turn that over, you can see I have a beautiful edge, and there's not a lot of bulk. So let me get this hand sewn on, those corners turned, and I'll show you what it looks like. So this mitered corner is right in line with the center, and this is the front. And the back, we have that mitered corner right there in that center. So it's beautiful on both sides. Pretty points with little mitered corners. I love the way it looks. I do hope that helps clear up some of the confusion about how to bind something that is not square. I'll put a link in the description to the video where I made this quilt and quilted the quilt. So now we have the binding done. And thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're getting done next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.